The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Okay, so hello and welcome back to the podcast, and today we are welcoming author and historian Jim Carter on to talk about his book, Hearts of Steel. It's an absolutely fantastic read. I really enjoyed reading it, and now I'm looking forward to talking to Jim all about it. So how are you doing, Jim?
I'm very good, thank you. Thanks for the compliment on the book. Glad you enjoyed it, and I'm fine. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Oh, I'm really glad that you're on here to talk about your book. I think it's been something that we've been talking about for a long time, and I'm so glad that we managed to get it in.
Yeah.
But the first question I want to ask you, as I ask all the guests who come onto the podcast, what inspired you to write this book?
Okay, so I've always had a love of history and military history in particular since I was a boy. And my grandmother gave me a coffee table book not so long ago, a few years back. And within it, she'd annotated a number of notes about her father, my great-grandfather. And it basically said he was in the Navy and he spent time aboard a destroyer, HMS Nubian. And I thought, well, I know a little bit about tribal class destroyers. This sounds really interesting. I'll look into her history a bit more. And then what really kicked it off is my mother had a copy of his service record, and his service record showed me that it went from 1918 through to 1945, and he served on 16 ships in total. And I thought, crikey, there must be a story amongst here, and really I ought to put something down on paper, not just for my own interest, but maybe for the kids as well. And that's where it kicked off, and it went from just being a few paragraphs to being about 500 pages.
I think that's a really lovely point. That there's something that you were interested in when you were growing up, and something that something personal to you, and how it's developed from that. I think that's a really lovely story. But inside your book, you're talking about the Navy and British Navy and some of the ships within the Navy. Now, for some people listening, they might not fully understand how important the Navy is to Britain. Could you just give us a little taste of why it is so important?
Well, if we look at the navalism as one, so at the turn of the into 1900s, Britain was gripped by what they called navalism, and navalism was really a political and military policy to maintain a strong and naval capability, and that's at the forefront of the country's interests and political interests and military interests. So the whole of the economy is based around the Navy, and the reason for that was because during that time the only way that we could trade with other countries and maintain the British Empire was by the sea. There were no planes in those days or anything like that. It all came via sea, so it was really vitally important for us to have a strong navy that protected those sea lanes and protected our interests overseas. And that in essence is what navalism is. And from there, sort of in 1904, a chap called Admiral Jackie Fisher took over the running of the Royal Navy, and he saw that it needed modernising at that point, and it needed bringing up in its technological status. He immediately scrapped about 150 ships and then started a program of shipbuilding again. And the Navy at that time was probably resting on its laurels a bit, 100 years worth of laurels from the times of Nelson and then Trafalgar. And he recognised that it all gone to sort of spit and polish, and you could buy your commissions and that kind of stuff. They'd stop recruiting sort of within and bringing people on. And so he modernised the Navy, brought in the dreadnoughts, looked at submarines and torpedo warfare, and really started modernising it and making it not only what the people thought about as being a fantastic organisation, but really being that fantastic organisation. And it had that pivotal role to play in the protection of the British Isles and the British Empire.
And that modernisation process is huge and has such a big effect on the Navy. During and after World War I, the Navy plays a big role in World War One. But what reputation does the Navy have afterwards, and what state is it in after such a devastating conflict?
Well, if we go back to the start of World War One, and it's in a real hiatus at the time. The public absolutely brought into the Royal Navy. They love it. They think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Projection of power, these fantastic new warships in dreadnoughts and the like. And as we go into First World War, the British public expected the Royal Navy to go out and hammer the Germans and destroy the German Navy. And they expected a battle like Trafalgar. Well, they got it, but they didn't really get the result that they wanted, because there was the Battle of Jutland on the 31st of May and 1st of June 1916. We ended up losing 3 battle cruisers in that, 6,000 men. That's nearly double the amount of Germans that were lost in that, and they lost 1 battle cruiser effectively. And that kind of to the public appeared like a defeat. It was a victory in that the Germans scuttled back to their ports and they never came out again. So it's a massive strategic victory in that, that battle was won, in inverted commas, but the public didn't see it that way. And the Navy was very slow to respond to that. And they didn't counter the argument. And that meant that the British public lost a lot of faith in the Royal Navy after the First World War. And it was kind of a bit of a rock bottom reputation. Now, obviously, once the war ended, the Navy began to contract anyway, because we didn't need as big a Navy. We still needed to protect our interests, but we didn't need to be that big, and personnel dropped off and the like. But then also there was the advent of the aircraft. So suddenly you're moving away from navalism and starting to look at different areas, modernizing the army, modernizing the air force, or building an air force. And so the Navy has to start competing with those other armed forces to get funds. So it was in a good position. It was still very large, but it had a bit of a dented rep, basically.
And then with that dented reputation, the change in focus, how does the Navy, the British Navy, adapt to this interwar period where there's very little conflict, but there's also a massive empire of which it needs to be able to protect?
We've got a huge British Empire to protect. It still has some really fine ships. It's been slightly restricted in shipbuilding by certain treaties during that period of time, but there are what they call stations throughout the globe. So there's things like the East Indies station in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the China station out of Singapore. In North America, there's the West Indies and like. So those stations are then served by a number of warships on a rotational basis. Generally, a commission in those days was 2.5 years long. So it's an awful long time you'd be away from your home and family. But they would be sending out, say, three cruisers, some supporting destroyers. They'd go to those stations, and it would be their job to operate out of those for the next 2.5 years and project the might of the British Empire, to show that we're there to protect our shipping, then to visit various ports in that region, winning hearts and minds, entertaining dignitaries, keeping those trades open. And so it was a very important role that they still played in sort of, just showing that the British Empire was still there, still intact, and still very viable.
I think the importance that the British Empire has been downplayed in recent years, the importance of that projection of power.
Yeah.
But during the 30s, the rumours of war, the rumblings of war, particularly from 33 onwards, kind of pick up. There's rumours of Germany's discontent with the post-World War I order. How does the British government and the British Navy respond to that? Because obviously that's a huge threat.
Quite slowly to begin with, as it is at the moment in many respects. But it did rapidly, suddenly it rapidly began to build up. There was a big modernisation of the fleet, a realisation that some of the battleships needed updating, and there were still these restrictions. There was the Washington Treaty and various stuff that said, okay, you're not going to build as many battleships. You're going to concentrate on cruisers of a certain size, that kind of stuff. So there was a rebuilding, but in a different way. I mean, whilst whilst you have these treaties, again, a bit like the nuclear treaties of today, their relevance starts to suddenly diminish, or in the eyes of certain countries. So people like Japan and Italy, and like, they were starting to go off and do their own thing. They say, well, actually, we might even drop that treaty altogether and go and build whatever we want. And Great Britain and the Royal Navy kind of adhered to the treaty still. We modernised battleships. Like Warspite was rebuilt from the bottom up. We built a few more battleships. We started building cruisers. And a good example is the destroyers that we're building. There was a whole new, from 1927 onwards, they started to build a whole new fleet of destroyers, 8 per year, over ran right the way through to into the war, and then they started to build even more. So there was quite an acceleration in this shipbuilding activity.
I think that really helps them attack that threat. Demonstrate that again. It's that might of the British Empire is trying to project.
Yeah.
And one of the main ships you talk about within your book, and I really did feel build a connection with this ship, really, is HMS Nubian.
Yeah.
What was this ship? And we've already touched on it very, very lightly so far. What was the ship, but what was it like? How was it able to be part of the Empire's projection of power?
Well, she was she was a tribal class destroyer. She was one of the first batch of 8 built at Thornycroft's on the Hamble off the Southampton water. She was 377 feet long, 35 knots, very heavily armored. She got 4 sets of 4.7-inch guns. So she was a very powerful, brand new warship at the time. She was a state-of-the-art piece of equipment, and she was crewed by hand-picked officers who were highly experienced guys that had come up into the Navy through the interwar years, and then her able seamen and petty officers and the like. A lot of those were hand-picked, very experienced crews who could then mentor the hostilities-only crews that came on board. So she was, she'd have been a very tight-knit community. There was only about 170 to 200 guys on her at one time. So a very, shall we say, a very professional, a very experienced bunch of guys that I'm sure were champing at the bit to get out there and do some action.
Why was it important for them to put experienced men on Nubian?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I got that from an interview from her first lieutenant of the Imperial War Museum. But I think because she was, at that point, we wanted to have the best. I mean, if you think about the Royal Navy, to join the Royal Navy in those days, it was a selection process, and 1 in 4 got through, roughly. So, and you've got a brand new ship. Let's put our best guys on it. Let's have the best crew that we possibly can on the best new piece of equipment that we've got. And I think it was probably just along those lines.
And I think that's a completely understandable perspective from them. Now, Nubian, obviously, you tell the story of World War II through her. And you mentioned that the first year or so of World War II is known as the Phony War, or particularly back home. Why is it called the Phony War, first of all? And then is there any kind of conflicts that are happening within that period?
Yep. Yeah. So the Phony War roughly ran from September 1939, when war was declared, through to around about April 1940. Yeah, 1940. Yeah. And during that time, there was no land offensive going on. The Germans didn't just immediately go to Dunkirk. They were getting ready to do that. There was no bombing of London immediately. Everything seemed quite quiet at home. However, on the sea, that was a bit of a different matter, because that was where stuff could begin to happen. So, for instance, you've got on the 13th of October 1939, Gunter Prien takes U-47 into Scapa Flow and he sinks Royal Oak. That's one particular offensive. So they're starting to feel out with the Germans are feeling out with their U-boats and start to do some damage. There were attacks on shipping, German air attacks certainly along the east coast of England, and on the 16th of October 1939, there was an attack on a convoy going up the east coast, and HMS Mohawk, which was Nubian's sister ship, both built together at Thornycroft. She was attacked and heavily damaged, and their captain was mortally wounded. So that was another thing that was going on. He was awarded the Empire Gallantry Medal. That was Captain Richard Jolly. And then, for instance, on the 30th of December 39, there's the Battle of the River Plate. So you had the Germans had Graf's Bay out in the Atlantic, causing a bit of havoc. Ends up in Montevideo, and there's the Battle of the River Plate, and she scuttled. So there were things going on, but they weren't on a this massive scale. They were in little incidents, as it were, that were probing.
And I can see how that doesn't really form part of the British public's consciousness at that point, because it's just so far removed from what they're doing.
Yeah.
Now, in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans had been limited to 6 battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, and no submarines, no military or naval air force. But obviously, Hitler has completely ignored this within the 30s and started to build up Germany's military power. What was their navy like at this point?
Well, it was building up. I mean, they're building Tirpitz and Bismarck, Prince Eugen, Nige now. They've got a range of destroyers, but they're still really not. They're not as large as the Royal Navy by any means. So they're becoming quite a strong force. And of course, Hitler never really understood the Navy. And in fact, in the end, he said, just get rid of it all because it's not worth having. But I mean, despite say, look at Tirpitz, for instance. Tirpitz was a massive deterrent for them. Churchill expended so much effort in making sure that thing was neutralised, and its presence caused the problem. So whilst it wasn't as large in numbers, it packed a heavy punch.
And you can certainly see that through Tirpitz and the U-boats. And you've mentioned how they're seeing Tirpitz as a threat, and Churchill's trying to make sure that threat is neutralised. The U-boats were also seen as a substantial threat as well. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, why is that? Well, they're going to attack shipping that's feeding us, feeding the country, feeding the war effort, bringing stuff over from the States, from all over the empire. So yeah, they're a massive threat. And of course, it's said that the Battle of the Atlantic, although Nubian wasn't involved in that at all, and that doesn't really come into my story, but the Battle of the Atlantic, it was vitally important. It was the main thing that won the war, is that it kept the sea lanes open and defeated the U-boats.
And that story of, the Nubian, and we're going to focus back on Nubian, the story that you tell, we're just after having that context of Germany's military naval might, Britain starts to fix their eyes on Norway. Norway's to the north of Germany. It's strategically important. But why do Britain start to have designs on Norway, and how do they try and use the navy to execute those?
Yeah, so Norway is kind of it's an interesting one, because it was the real first proper land campaign that Great Britain gets involved in. Initially, Churchill he wanted to do something, and the first thing we noticed was that iron ore was coming out of Narvik. Swedish high grade iron ore was coming out of Narvik, and the Germans were taking it down through the Leads, which are all these little islands along the western coast of Norway, and they were effectively getting round the issue, because Norway was neutral, so they'd send their ships through the Leads, which were Norwegian waters, and then they could sneak out of the bottom and get over to Germany. And Churchill was incensed by this, because he said, really, the Norwegians shouldn't be allowed to do this. They should go in international water, and then we can confront them and legally. And he wanted to, first of all, mine the Leads, and he was denied doing that. But then he was also looking at Norway as possibly a route into northern Germany if he needed to. So if we occupied Norway, it would be a British and French force that goes into Norway, and therefore provides the defence for Norway, because they don't really have a strong military force, and then they could launch an attack into Germany from Norway. And there's the iron ore, of course. So it was quite an interesting bit. It should have been a soft target in inverted commas, because they expected the Norwegians to take us on with open arms. course, the trouble was that the Germans were thinking exactly the same at the same time, and 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 basically they were looking at Norway as being a base for submarine operations into the North Atlantic and the North Sea. So, and that ended up with both the Germans and the British, launching a campaign against Norway at exactly the same time.
And as so always happens in war, two sides have almost identical ideas, and it doesn't seem to really play out in a way that either expect.
No.
But then within your story after Norway, Nubians deployed to the Mediterranean, which I think is very, very interesting. Why was she redeployed to the Mediterranean? Why is the Mediterranean important?
Well, so in the Eastern Mediterranean in Alexandria, Admiral Cunningham, who's in charge of the Eastern Mediterranean Fleet, he's wanting to build up his forces again. He's had the Eastern Mediterranean Fleet was basically had everything taken away from it to go into Norway, do other stuff, and he's left with nothing. So now he says, right, we need to build that back up again because there is possible threat from Germany. We need to keep Turkey neutral. We need to protect the Suez Canal, the oil supply from Iran and Iraq, especially because everything ran on oil from there. And if we don't do that, then everything's got to go round the Cape of Good Hope, round Africa, down the Horn of Africa. So, and of course, they needed to keep the shipping lanes open in the Mediterranean between Gibraltar and Alexandria via Malta, keep Malta. So it's a very important area, big presence in North Africa as well. And Egypt was basically surrounded. If you look at the map of the Mediterranean in those days, you've got the Italians in Libya, the Vichy France, as it would be. They were allies at the time, but Vichy France would control the other side, and then you got Italy to the north. Turkey's important to maintain neutrality because they're holding everything back from getting into the Middle East. So it was a vitally important area. So he needed to build up a big fleet to make sure that was protected.
And that context surrounding the area is very important because I think it's a theatre that, as often with World War One studies, it's very Western Front orientated. So that context is really important. Now, there's quite a few naval battles within the Mediterranean because of the importance of keeping these shipping routes open, and Nubian was also part of those battles. So how does she fare in these battles? How do these battles begin? Because naval battles are very different to land-based battles.
Yeah, very much so. So, really, it was the Italians to begin with. The Italians have got a big fleet at that time. They're a very modern fleet, although they didn't have radar, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think. But although they didn't have radar, they had some very fast, modern warships. They were the 5th largest navy in the world at that time. Now, the only thing is that they were the Italian commanders were reluctant to use them. They kept them in port an awful lot. And they didn't like to take these nice, bright, shiny ships out and put them in harm's way. So really, it was Cunningham's job and his staff's job to try and coax them out. And they generally did that through the convoys, going backwards and forwards between Malta and Alexandria and Gibraltar and the like. And so they'd try and send a nice, juicy convoy out that would hopefully draw the Italian navy out, and then they could attack them. And that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Matapan. It was a particular convoy that was heading towards Malta at the time, and the German High Command had said, "Look, we're helping you guys as much as we can, but you need to do your bit. Get an operation going." It was actually on sort of some false information that they had at the time, but the Italians said, "Okay, we're going to attack this convoy." In the meantime, Cunningham got the convoy to turn around and go back, and he sent out the British fleet to attack them, and that's kind of how these things evolved.
It's interesting how there's false information plays a role in that as well, because that's also something that's prevalent on the land assaults as well. Now, how do the British and the Italian navies see one another? Because obviously the British and the Germans definitely see each other as a threat. But the Italian Navy, as you said, they don't like to send them out. They have these big, nice, shiny boats that they don't want to deploy. And the British Empire and the British Navy, as you said, are sending convoys out. Have they got a perception of each other's might?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and it was a bit of a concern because whilst we had numbers, they had a number of 8-inch cruisers. Most of ours were 6-inch cruisers. So they had from gunnery perspective, the Italians had the legs on the British Navy at the time, and so it was going to be important to have some big battle probably with battleships involved. And so I think there was a lot of respect. There's certainly a lot of respect. Whether that was, I doubt that came from Mussolini. I should think he thought he could wipe the floor with us easily. He was a big arrogant bloke, but I think there was a lot of respect between the two navies, and it was just how to deploy it. The real big problem with Regia Marina was that they had Super Marina as the overarching command structure, and the Italian commanders on the ships, they would follow those orders, get those orders from Super Marina, go and start carrying them out. And then if something happened that meant, okay, we need to change this, we need to do something different, they had to go back to Super Marina and ask for permission to change that before they could actually action it. And that's a very top-down command that just doesn't work, as we know. And again, you can see that with the Russian forces today. They've had exactly the same problem, whereas the British side is a lot more flexible and a lot more able to be more agile, shall we say, in business terms.
And that flexibility and that agility definitely helps across all of naval conflicts for Britain. Mm-hmm. But there's also conflicts, and you've mentioned before, there's conflicts going off around the Mediterranean. You have the Greek conflicts with the Axis powers, which the British help with. There's conflicts in North Africa. How does the British Navy seek to support its troops in Italy, Greece, and Northern Africa?
Yeah, okay. So we've got Operation Compass goes on to begin with, which is effectively supposed to be a five-day campaign to kick the Italian army out of Egypt, because they've wandered in there by 60 miles and then camped up there for a while. That lasts 10 weeks in the end and pushes them all the way back to the Battle of Bida Fom, which I don't think is picked up. There's not enough credence given for that. That was an amazing campaign. So, but to support those guys on the way, the Navy was doing naval bombardments, so following the progress of along the coast, bombarding the Italian positions from the sea, resupplying as well. There was a lot of water resupply went on through the Navy. HMS Terror was a monitor, big single gun platform, and she spent a lot of time resupplying water, believe it or not, to the troops. So that was a very logistical and naval support type role that they had. And then of course there's the evacuations that we have. So of course you have this great campaign. Operation Compass comes to an end. We send half the troops to Greece, the other half remain to get kicked back to Alexandria, almost to Alexandria by Rommel, and the other half goes to Greece and gets hammered there. And fortunately, Cunningham had the foresight that, okay, I'm going to have to transport these troops from North Africa out to Greece. And he said at the same time, I think I'm going to plan that. How do we get them out again if there's a problem? So he had the foresight of doing that, and he had a plan in place that if they were kicked out of Greece, which they were, then he could evacuate the troops via the warships again and get them to Crete. But then they had exactly the same problem.
Well, you've just led into my next question there. What happens with Crete? Because obviously the Axis powers capture Greece, and we have to evacuate British troops and the Greek government, Greek royal family, Greek forces. So what happens at Crete, and how does the Navy and Nubian play a role in that?
Yeah, so at Crete, as you probably know, it was mainly an airborne assault by the Germans, but and it was known that it was going to be an airborne assault, but it was also expected. It was expected that there would be a sea-based assault as well, an amphibious assault, and there was probably too much emphasis. Certainly, I think it was Freiberg was in charge, and he really expected a naval bomb. He didn't expect there to be an airborne one. He thought it was going to be a naval attack. So the Royal Navy was deployed on all four corners of Crete, effectively, to make sure that amphibious assault didn't take place. And they did there was an amphibious assault, and it was repulsed. But of course, the main thrust was airborne. The major problem for the Royal Navy was that there was absolutely no air cover provided by the Allies. We had about 2 or 3 planes on Crete itself, a handful on Malta, and the Germans had entered it alongside the Italians at that point and had air superiority effectively, and that meant that we lost a number of ships. So they were trying to provide a protective role first of all for the island, which failed because it just couldn't happen. The troops got overrun, and then they've got to get them out of there. So they had to evacuate them from ports that were well within airstrike distance. I mean, they could do 2 or 3 strikes per day on Crete, the Axis forces. So they were under constant bombardment. So they had to change the tactics and try and get everybody off at night. And the ports that they had were very, very poor. I think it's Sfakia in the south is almost a cliff. I've never been there, but I've read about it. It's almost a cliff road down to a very tiny port, and you're trying to evacuate a whole army out of there. So their options were very minimal, but they got a lot of them off.
And what happens to Nubian within this conflict?
Nubian gets damaged, so she's supposed to be looking after HMS Formidable, who it ended up that she was left with about, should we say, a dozen aircraft. Can't remember quite off the top of my head. And they decide we're going to make an attack on one of the larger Axis airfields with this small force. So they go out at night, they do the raid on the airfield, and then they need to get back before it gets light. And of course, on the way back, Formidable and her escorts get caught in the open effectively and attacked by Ju-87s and Ju-88s. And Nubian, during her role, is lured away. She comes under attack herself, is lured away from protecting Formidable as the other ships. Formidable's attacked, and then Nubian's attacked, and has a 500 kilogram bomb hit her on the stern, which blows the back end completely off, kills 20 guys. But whilst her rudder's shot away, she can still steer by her propellers, and they manage to actually get her back to Alexandria, which is a feat in its own right.
It certainly is. But how do you repair a ship that's been hit by something like that?
Well, you have to take it out of the theatre, which happened to Illustrious and a lot of the others if they were really badly damaged. So Nubian went off to Bombay, as it was then, to the Royal Dockyard there, and she was out of action until October 1942. She had a complete refit and repair of her back end. So it was major works like that couldn't really be repaired in theatre. They could do minor works, and refits and bits and pieces, but bomb damage like that, she had to go away to be rebuilt effectively.
And when you're talking about how ships have to take on aircraft, how does the Navy, across the course of the war, how does it adapt to fighting against aircraft? Because obviously it's very different to what they've done previously.
Yeah. Slowly is one, because the threat from the air was quite heavily dismissed by many people in the Navy for a long time. It was always thought the capital ship will always destroy any aircraft that attack it, and it will be fine. And that's clearly proved wrong with the Prince of Wales and Repulse. And early anti-aircraft gunnery was pretty woeful. The Nubian and most of the destroyers, their main armament couldn't go any higher than 40 degrees. So they were really restricted in what they can do. So you're stuck with pom-poms, which were early design anti-aircraft batteries that weren't particularly reliable. They used to jam all the time, and then machine guns. So their anti-aircraft stuff was pretty poor, and it wasn't really until you get Ehrlichens come along and that kind of stuff that it gradually, the importance of it, good anti-aircraft gunfire, becomes really prevalent, later on in the war.
And then for those later years in the war, Nubian's obviously back after getting a refit in Bombay. What role does she take in this conflict after playing such a prominent role in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, so she goes straight back to the Med, and for the next two years, she plays another prominent role, which is worth me having a look into a bit more at another time, because she was involved in Operation Husky, the retaking of Sicily, and interestingly, in there, I found out that she escorted the Ulster Monarch into Augusta, which Damien Lewis covered in Forged in Hell. So the SAS troops that went in on Ulster Monarch, they had Nubian by her side, getting her into Augusta. So that was pretty cool. Then she was at Operation Avalanche, the landings at Salerno, and she was gunfire support there. So she was one of the ships that was just sat off providing naval gunfire support, getting calls in from artillery spotters inland, directing gunfire onto positions from there. So she played a prominent role in that. And after that, she went back to the UK for a refit. Didn't come back out until 1944. She did a little bit of escort duty, and she did escort one of the attacks on Tirpitz when they launched air attacks from aircraft carriers before going out to the Pacific. A little bit out there. She was involved in sinking a Japanese cruiser out there, and then the war ended, basically. And I think she was in Penang at the time of the war ended. And then, unfortunately, she survived the war. She went to be a target ship for a while up at Loch Scriven, and then she was scrapped in 1948.
Yeah, her story seems for me that it reflects Britain's war effort and how Britain's war effort across the world ebbs and flows. But then for her to meet that sad end of being scrapped after the war, you make that a very emotional point in your book. So thank you for bringing that. Now I have a final fun question for you, Jim.
Yeah.
Now, you are also a pilot, which I think is incredibly cool. Which is the most interesting airport you've ever landed at as a pilot?
Well, I'm going to answer it in two parts. The first part is the next one, because being a pilot, you always like to push yourself. So I always like to go somewhere new. Once you've been to one place, then I've been there, done that. Let's go and test ourselves. So you always push yourself. But I think the second part, I think probably a toss up between Duxford, going to visit the museum, and Goodwood, which is fairly local to me. And Goodwood's great because they've got the two-seat Spitfires there, and flying into Goodwood, you're privileged to be airside, so you can literally walk up and touch them. Not quite unless you get past them, obviously, but you can get really up close and personal with a Spitfire, and that's pretty cool.
I think that's an awesome answer, and to be landing in the same airfield as Spitfires, I think I think that definitely wins.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Now, people have listened to us talk about Hearts of Steel. Where can they grab a copy, and where can they find you and your work online, Jim?
Okay, so you just go into any bookshop and they'll order it for you. That's not a problem. Or you can do the other way of going to Amazon. Obviously, it's on Amazon. There's an Audible version as well, which is on Apple too, so you can listen to it. And you can find me either Facebook or LinkedIn under Jim Carter Online, and I've got a website, Jim Carter Online, as well. You can order, if you want a signed copy, you can order the book through there.
Fantastic. And I'll make sure that they're in the description linked so people can go and grab themselves a copy, but also interact with you as well.
Yeah, I'll always look, quite happy to have emails from anybody. Not a problem.
And I've also got one more thing to ask you as well. People who listen to the podcast might know that we're heading to Chalke this summer, but you're also going to be at Chalke. So how can they listen to you talk about your work at Chalke? Okay,
so I've been lucky. I'm at Speaker's Corner on the Wednesday at 3:30. So I've got a little half-hour slot just to talk about Nubian and crew. I've got to work out what I'm going to say yet, but I'm really looking forward to that. I've been there for 10 years as a visitor, so it's quite fun to be there and doing something this time.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm looking forward to meeting you at Chalke in person.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. So thank you very much for coming on, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Real pleasure.
Now, thank you very much for listening to this episode that we did with Jim Carter as part of our Chalke History Festival special series here on History with Jackson. Now, if you want to grab yourself a ticket to Chalke History Festival, it is happening between the 24th and the 30th of June. And you can head to this link in the description below to get yourself some tickets, which are selling out fast. And if you want to see Jim talk all about his work, HMS Nubian and Hearts of Steel, he will be there on the 26th of June in Speakers Corner. Now, thank you very much for listening to this episode. This coming week, we have got our Chalke History Festival content coming to you. So you're going to have a load of podcast episodes coming to you where we're discussing the work of some of the historians who will be there at the festival.